Next up, I want to talk about table layouts and styles. This is a really important lecture because there are a few reasons why you very well may want to use different types of table layouts. And in fact, the default options that Excel provides, in my opinion, really aren't the most useful formats at all. So let's take a walk through and I'll show you what some of these options are. So again, within Pivot Table Tools, you've got Analyze options and Design options. For this lecture, let's focus on the Design tab. And here you've got your layout choices on the left and all of your style options to the right. Now the style options really speak for themselves. Just like you can format a table, you can also format a pivot table with all of these different stock templates that Excel provides. Personally, I like to keep it simple and just go with one of the light options. If you don't want any formatting at all, you can choose the upper left option. Let's just stick with something kind of like this. And then other style options here, you can turn on or off the shading on your row or column headers, and you can add banding to your rows or columns just to help differentiate those. Personally, I typically don't use banded rows or columns, but totally subjective, up to you. And then that brings us to the layout options here on the left. I want to take some time to really talk about what these options provide. And to do that, I'm going to reorganize this pivot table just a little bit. And I'm going to pull genre out of the column labels and nest it under country as a second set of row labels. And let's also bring in color, black and white, and drag that in as a third element. So by default, as I do this, you can see here in the pivot table that it's essentially nesting those dimensions or categories one under the other, all contained within one column called row labels. And this is what we call a compact table style, and it's the default style that Excel will use as a starting point. And if we go up to the report layout options, you can see that compact form is the first option here on the list. So one thing that I don't like about compact form is that it combines or condenses these fields such that it becomes very difficult or impossible to apply things like filters or sorting options to these individual fields because they're all contained within the same row labels. Which brings me to the second layout style, which is actually the one that I prefer by default, called the outline form. And when I switch the table to outline form, it essentially breaks out that one row label column into three individual columns, one for each dimension or field here in my row label box. So now I have a column for country, a column for genre, and a column for black and white. They're still nested in within each other as they should be, but now I have the option to apply things like sorting options, label filters, value filters, etc. And we're going to talk all about how to do sorting and filtering later in the course, but just keep in mind that the outline form is a really nice way to kind of split these fields out so that you can edit them as you wish. And then our third report layout, which we're going to talk about in depth in the next lecture, is called tabular form. And when you click on tabular form, it essentially tries to recreate the look and feel of a table. So what it does is that it actually puts the country, genre, and color black and white label all on the same row to kind of replicate what this data would look like as a raw data set or table. And again, we're going to dive into that and show you a quick example of that in the next lecture. But let's jump back to outline form again and talk about some of these other options. One option is to repeat the item labels, and that just fills in the blanks. Again, as it sounds, it's just repeating the labels in each row. If you want to turn that off, you can just choose this last option here. And then similar option here with blank rows. If you want to just space things out and make it a little bit more readable, you can insert a blank row after each section of data, and then go ahead and remove it if you choose you don't want that. And then finally, we've got our subtotal and grand total options. This is just really determining if you want to show these totals either for your rows or your columns. You can toggle these on or off. Right now I actually just have one grand total line which would show up at the very bottom, and I've just turned it off so there's nothing after row 418. If I turn that on, there you go, it pops back up. And then similarly with subtotals, these are the totals that show up for individual categories or row labels. So if you don't show the subtotals, you'll see all those numbers disappear. Whereas if you do enable subtotals, you can choose to visualize them at the bottom of the group, like so, or at the top of the group, like this. So Australia revenue as a whole, 1.5 billion. Action movies in Australia, 843 million. Black and white action movies drove 9 million, whereas color drove 834 million. So those subtotals do help to kind of show how things are aggregating at different levels of your data. But sometimes you don't want those, so you can toggle those on and off right here. So those are table layouts in a nutshell. Next up, we're going to talk specifically about using tabular form to essentially produce a new source data set using a pivot table.